In this video, I want to talk about Elizabeth's classic objection to Cartesian dualism. So we were just looking at how the body can use in the mind, and so how the mind and body interact. And Elizabeth presses Descartes on how could we have interaction between a mind and a body. Let me first say a little bit, give you a little bit of background on Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was the Princess of Bohemia, the third child of 12, born into a noble family that lost a lot of their wealth, but who still had a lot of political influence. Elizabeth was incredibly smart. She had a knack for languages and picked up Latin and Greek when she was very young. By the age of 7, she was using both fluently. In her early 20s, she read the Meditations and met Descartes for the first time. And by the time she was a teenager, she was well known for her intellect. And the story is that in part because of her family's financial troubles, and in part because of their political troubles, and in part because her suitors were intimidated by how sharp she is, she never marries. Instead, she eventually became the abbess of a large convent that oversaw 7,000 people. And although throughout her life, she carried on correspondences with many of the leading intellectuals of her day. Descartes, just one of them. So she also corresponded with William Penn and Leibniz, who we're also going to be looking at. And so at the beginning of the course, I said that early modern philosophers could be contrasted with Aristotelian philosophers in 2 respects, right? So in one respect, the early modern guys accept that the sciences of nature are mechanical and mathematical, which means that there's no room for appeals to final causes. And second, that the nature of our knowledge is different. So in Descartes, knowledge from the intellect is prior to knowledge from the senses, whereas for the scholastics, remember, there was nothing in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses. So these contrasts are going to be important in understanding the Elizabeth correspondence. So the first contrast is for the early moderns. Remember, they want to give a mathematical and mechanical account of nature and the natural world, where this means that there are no final causes. And then they also gave an account of our knowledge, where while by things outside of ourselves, those things don't necessarily resemble the things that cause them. Those ideas don't necessarily resemble the things that cause them. Right, so they're rejecting that, although the things outside still the cause the idea. Right? So we've got the sun and my idea, and it's not the case. No, doesn't resemble, right? But it does cause. Okay, there you go. So those are 2 ways in which the early moderns contrast with the scholastics and the Aristotelians. And the issue that Elizabeth raises hits exactly the first of these 2. So we're going to see how the issue she's raising hits exactly the first of these, and it's a serious issue. So and her question is, how can there be a causal connection between 2 things as distinct as the Cartesian mind and the Cartesian body? And this has become the classic objection to Cartesian dualism. So let's look at this passage here where she makes the objection. So she says, so I ask you please to tell me how the soul, human being, it being only a thinking, can determine the bodily spirits. How can a thinking substance determine the bodily spirits in order to bring about voluntary actions? For it seems that all determination of movement happens through first the impulsion of the thing moved, right? Things bumping into one another, say, by the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else, third, by the particular qualities and shape of the surface of the latter. Physical contact is required for the first two conditions, and extension for the third. You entirely exclude the one, extension, from the notion you have of the soul, and the other, physical contact, appears to be incompatible with an immaterial thing. Right? So if the idea is, if these three things are the conditions for causing motion, if all motion is going to be caused through one of these three things, well, then how can an immaterial thing, like a thinking substance, cause motions? After all, an immaterial thing, a thinking substance, doesn't have any of these three features and can't, right? So the basic idea is that if the motions of material things are completely determined by the mechanical motions of other material things, then how could the mind, an immaterial thing, have any effect on material things? Okay. Well, in other words, Descartes says that the objection rests on the assumption that because two things are different kinds of substances, they cannot interact. And Descartes wants to reject this assumption. This seems to be why he brings up heaviness or gravity. But on Descartes' view, we don't explain motion through the substantial form. I mean, so he brings up heaviness and gravity, but he says, well, but it's not like gravity or heaviness properly conceived. Rather, it's like Aristotle conceived of them. Well, how did Aristotle conceive of heaviness or gravity? Well, remember, the falling ball is composed of earth, right? And earth wants to go down. Earth is heavier than air. And so the Aristotelian explained gravity because the things that fell had a higher portion of earth in them than they did air, and so they went towards the earth. But remember, Descartes denies such an Aristotelian conception of gravity due to substantial forms, right? I mean, it's the nature of earth and its form that makes earth what it is, that is what ultimately explains gravity. But that explanation in terms of substantial forms is exactly what the modern mathematical and mechanical conception of nature is rejecting, right? We're not supposed to have any final causes. And if the soul moves the body, well, this just seems like another Aristotelian substantial form. The soul is an inner principle that's not susceptible to mathematical study, and so it doesn't seem like the kind of appeal to a non-mechanistic inner principle should be open to Descartes by his own lights, right? I mean, it seems like if the soul is like gravity, and And gravity is to be explained through a substantial form or a final cause, a final resting place of Earth being on the ground, right? The ball strives to attain its purpose, its end, its goal of getting on to the ground. If the soul is like that in moving the body, right? The soul is like an inner principle of motion, like Aristotelian Earth. Well, then it's a final cause, right? I mean, the motion of the body is for the final cause of preserving the mind, doing what the mind wants to do. But Descartes was rejecting such appeals to final causation, it seems. And so how is this line of response available to Descartes? It seems like a big problem. Well, he goes on and he gives a second kind of reply, and he says, well, it does not seem that the human mind is capable of conceiving very distinctly and at the same time the distinction between the soul and the body and their union, since to do so, it's necessary to conceive of them as one single thing, and at the same time to conceive of them as two, which is contradictory. Well, so what's the thought? Well, the idea is, if you want to explain mind-body interaction, well, then you have to understand the human being as a composite of mind and body. And so you have to conceive of the human being as this blended thing that's both a soul and the body, and yet one thing, one human being. And yet we already saw that there's a real distinction between the soul and the body. And we had clear and distinct ideas of each. And so we saw that they're really two things. They're not one thing. And so trying to understand the relationship between the soul and the body, and how the soul can move the body, it seems like it's necessary to conceive of them as one thing, yet we've seen that, well, when we conceive of them clearly and distinctly, they're two things. And so explaining how the soul can move the body, Descartes' claiming, is going to commit us to a confusion. We have to confuse two things together and take them to be one thing. But that's a confusion. I mean, that's contradictory. We're thinking something is true that can't be true. And so Descartes seems to be claiming how the soul moves the body is essentially obscure. It's essentially obscure. It depends on a confusion. But you might think, well, that's not very satisfying. That doesn't actually give us an explanation of how the soul moves the body, right? That just tells us that we can't understand how the soul moves the body. And so that doesn't seem to be an answer to Elizabeth's objection at all. It just seems to be saying, we can't answer your objection. And so that doesn't seem like a very satisfying answer either. Okay, in the next video, we're going to turn to Locke and some of the differences between Locke and Descartes and Leibniz. And Leibniz is going to be taking up a position that is in many respects very close to Descartes, but this will be a little off the table for what we're talking about, but Leibniz allows final causes back in. So he allows that we can't get away from final causes entirely. And we have to allow some formal and final causes of the Aristotelian variety. Okay, see you in the next video.